Like H.P. Lovecraft, our next author wrote a very interesting story about some old gods returning to the earth. Gertrude Mabel Barrows was born on September 18th, 1883, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her father died in 1892, and a few years later, Gertrude left school after eighth grade, where she started to work to support her family. She had dreams on becoming an illustrator, but she never did, and instead pursued stenography work, which she fell back on as a reliable source of employment for much of her life. She started writing at the age of 17 when she submitted her story, The Curious Experience of Thomas Dunbar, to Argosy, which was published in March of 1904. This was her only story for a while, and in 1909 or in 1910, sources are conflicting here, she married Stuart Bennett and moved to Philadelphia, had a daughter, but her husband, who worked as a newspaper reporter, died suddenly and tragically while seeking underwater treasure. And all the sources that talk about this mention it in such an offhand manner, and I kind of
Yeah.
wonder, like,
What's the story?
yeah.
Yeah. Some of these bios are pretty strange, and you have to kind of pause a little bit when you read about some of this stuff. And it's like,
Yeah, unfortunately, Barrows, I guess later Bennett, was a rather obscure figure in that not much is known about her personal life, and what is known is kind of pieced together from these vague details, and it really makes you want to know more. But after her husband died, she again needed to support her family, including her mother, who at this point was quite ill, so she turned to writing again and submitted her story, The Nightmare, to All Story Weekly, which frequently published stories by women. Bennett did not decide on the pseudonym Frances Stevens, but she requested the pseudonym Jean Vale, and for whatever reason, the editor at All Story put the name Frances Stevens under the byline, and it just kind of stuck. She was highly prolific between 1917 and 1920, when she wrote a great deal of short stories and novellas, many of which were published in All Story. And in 1920, her writing stops, and details of her life from this point on are very few and far between. Did she remarry? Did her mother die? Nobody really knows. Her only story published after this period was her story in Weird Tales, Sunfire, which was published in two issues, first appearing in the third volume of the magazine, so pretty early on, though it's been speculated that this story was actually written earlier, not later than 1919, and was just sold to the magazine later when they were first starting up. She was possibly estranged from her daughter late in life and died in 1948, but even this date was uncertain for a while, with some early scholars in the area speculating that she died earlier. I guess it was confirmed later on. Her work was reprinted in the 1940s by Mary Nadinger, who was the editor of Famous Fantastic Mysteries and Fantastic Novels, including Claimed. So Claimed was initially published in Argosy from March 6th to March 20th of 1920, and then was reprinted in the April 1941 issue of Famous Fantastic Mysteries. And if you read this one, and I suggest you do, look at the issue of Famous Fantastic Mysteries, as it has some really cool illustrations that aren't in the Argosy publication or some of the standalone novel reprints of it. It has been republished several times in book form, and one of her most popular novels and one of the most well received, cited as being Gary Hoppenstand's favorite, who wrote the introduction to an anthology of her short stories, The Nightmare and Other Tales of Dark Fantasy. So, Claimed itself opens up with the log of a Captain Charles Jessamy, who is the master of the Portsmouth Belle. At sea, they've encountered some anomaly and their instruments have been affected, but it appears while they're not able to tell where they are exactly, they're approaching some island. And on the island, the rock formations look like ruins, but it's really hard to tell at the distance that they're at, and rocks can sometimes be worn away through the millennia and eons in very strange ways, so they're really not sure what they are. But the captain and James Blair are the only two to disembark and set foot on the isle, which is seemingly still volcanically active, with poisonous gas everywhere. Blair tries to take some lava as a souvenir, but burns his hand, much to the amusement of the other crew. but he is able to get it on board. And our narrative shifts to chapter 1. So it starts off in a shop of curiosities and knickknacks owned by a Jacob Lutz, a Jewish shopkeeper. And in his shop, a gray eyed man is inquiring about an object he had previously sold Lutz, but Lutz had already sold it to somebody else. And this man says that he knows something fishy about it. And Lutz eventually gives him the name of a Mr. Robinson, who is the person he sold it to. And he's really getting annoyed at this stranger's strange talk. But the two eventually get to talking about an inscription, which was on the item he sold him, a odd box. So, at the Robinsons' abode, an old man, Jesse, is with his niece, Layla, and they're marveling at this blue-green box that he had just purchased from Lutz. And it does indeed have some very strange inscriptions on it. The box itself appears to be of a very strange material and resists being scratched, and maybe even moves by itself. That night, a Dr. Vanneman receives a call to attend on Robinson, who is the rich owner of Robinson Brothers Engine Works. He hurries over to his place and notices that a large window has been smashed out and is shown in by Leela, who was the one who called him in the first place. As the doctor is administering treatment and observing Robinson, there seems to be signs of a struggle, and Leela thinks there was a thief in the house. She said that a rough-looking man came by asking about the box and left the card, and the butler admitted him to see old Robinson. They met in private for about a half an hour when Leela heard shouting and a crash, and the man had apparently tried to steal the box, was unsuccessful, so I guess he just jumped out the window. When Layla comes into the room, old Robinson is grasping it in his arms in the midst of all this, and the doctor is quite struck by Leela's beauty. However, he thinks she's deliberately holding something back and is a bit intrigued by this whole mystery. Leela had called for him as their regular doctor, who was not available, and eventually their attention is drawn to the box. The doctor flips it over, and Leela asks about the inscriptions, which the doctor can't make heads or tails of, but he thinks it looks like hieroglyphs. However, old Robinson comes to and shoots up and grabs the box. And he has a real, Gollum Lord of the Rings moment here and says, what I want I get, and what I get I keep. They can't take it away from old Jesse Robinson. Nobody can take it. You hear me?
Yeah, he's always saying that motto, too. It's repeated throughout.
Yeah, that'll be in a lot of this.
Yeah,
and it resurfaces at the very end of the book in a most amusing way, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
But, so what I want, I get.
Yeah.
And what I get, I keep.
Yeah, his precious. So Vanneman's spending the night over, and Robinson is being difficult, wanting to know why the doctor's there. But when the doctor says he'll leave him, he immediately changes his tune and begs him to stay. So Vanneman does, and as he's dozing off, he starts to hear a faint sound, a strange hiss, kind of a rumble and a murmur growing nearer and louder. And the door to the room burst open. It seems to be the sea itself, pushing near him, flooding the room, and filling him with this fear and paralysis. And the room is bathed in the strange green light, and Robinson starts muttering something about horses, white horses, and the bloody throats of white horses, and he shoots out of bed, screaming, which breaks Vanneman out of this weird paralysis. It seems that Robinson's had another seizure, and Leela's coming into the room, and the green box is now glowing. In the morning, Vanneman tells Leela to call Dr. Bruce, who is their regular doctor, and he has a nurse sent out, and he's unable to ask her about the box. Later, Bruce tells Vanneman he approves of Vanneman's treatment, and it seems that Robinson wants Vanneman there for a companion. He offers good pay, but it seems like a rather strange request, especially as Robinson keeps going on about his box and how it's his and all that stuff. But fortunately, Vanneman has no regular clients, as he just opened up shop 3 days ago, so he accepts. A few days later, Leela and Vanneman are talking about what to do with the box, and they agree to exchange information. Vanneman tells her that he'll believe anything she says, and his mind somehow goes to the example of the serpent Midgard.
Yeah, the word she wanted to use was Jormungand, I think?
Yeah.
Yes, it's not, the name of a serpent is not Midgard. Midgard is the name of the world which the human race and all the creatures of the earth inhabit. Right. I think she screwed up on her
Probably.
Norse mythology there a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And you can tell that in a way that she wrote this for money and that it does feel very pulpy
Yeah.
in some senses. And it might not be the most like historically accurate thing as far as the mythology goes, and that comes up a bit later for sure. But this is a lot of fun, and I think she does have a talent for writing these things, even if she does make some small mistakes like that
Yeah.
here and there.
So I guess that's kind of a nitpicky thing to nitpick about, but
Oh no, but I mean it's perfectly fine. I mean, I some of the best parts of reading some of those Jules Verne novels is Butcher telling us how off his math is, or how this wouldn't really make sense, or that way, and noticing those little mistakes here and there, I think is part of the fun of reading these stories.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, so Leela says that she found her uncle in a heap, and that there was something wild and flat and dark and hissing in the room with him, and she also saw the flood of water that Vanneman did. And he notices the inscription on the box seems to move, and he wants to test something, though it doesn't produce any results right away. But Vanneman says that Jesse will know more, but he's quite difficult and protective of the box. And he proposes that there might be a supernatural element here, and talks about psychometry, and maybe the box emits a psychic impression that can be read by a sensitive. They'd like to track down this mysterious visitor who came to the house, but Lutz is out of town for a while. And while they're planning all of this, their attention was elsewhere from the box. And now that their attention is back on the box, Vanneman notices that the inscriptions have moved once again. So it appears that when they're looking at the box, it doesn't move, but when their attention is away, it does.
Don't blink.
Yeah. So Jesse is coming back into the house, and they have a newspaper that announces a suicide of somebody at the Atlantic City beach. A man who led a white horse onto the beach and exchanges some rather rude remarks with one of the guards there, but he suddenly slashes a knife at the guard and then cuts the horse's neck and jumps off and pier onto the sea. The horse's wound apparently wasn't fatal, so it just kind of ran off. But the next day, the newspaper says the man was Jacob Lutz, and he had recently bought the white horse, and the details in the case seem to be very strange, especially the level of detail that the paper goes into about it. Doesn't read like a
Yeah.
typical newspaper account, but that's okay.
Well, yeah.
Veneman's reading this in the paper, and he has the same strange dreams again of the green sea tide invading his bedchamber. And Leela doesn't know about the white horse, but Vanneman immediately links the two. And with this suicide, he gives up on tracking down the original owner of the box. He has a Professor Shellback, somebody he knows, help him translate the inscription. And help keep himself sane, Vanneman leaves the house for an hour a day. And one day, Robinson says he can take Leela out, and in the car even. They have a nice drive along the Delaware River, but they're both reminded of the rising tide, which will horribly return that night. They see a man leading a white horse. The man tells him that it's a great deal for a white horse and much better than Lutz could have done, and he addresses Vanneman by name, personally, and asks him if he thinks so. And Vanneman is startled by this and wants to know how he knows his name. And the man tells him all he knows about his business and that soon he'll be wanting a white horse too. He also says to tell Robinson that Jim Blair wouldn't stand in his shoes for 3 times his money. And with this, him and the horse go off. And when they get back, Vanneman asks Robinson about Lutz and why the horse, and why Blair cut the throat of his horse in the river. Robinson refuses to give up any information, and Vanneman indicates that he would leave unless he tells him, and Vanneman eventually caves and stays, Robinson refusing to tell him anything. But that night there is a huge downpour up the Atlantic, and the Delaware River surges and floods. And the next day, Vanneman's Aunt Jane shows up, who is a spiritualist. And she's talked with Vanneman's grandfather's ghost, so we know she's for real.
Yeah. I'm really sad that she didn't end up being a part of the story.
Yeah, I thought she was cool.
Yeah, I was looking forward to this, like, cool, middle-aged, and psychic investigator character. I thought she was going to be a thing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't see too much of her, but
No.
yeah, due to her sense of abilities, Vanneman asks her if she can discern anything about the box, and she goes into her spiritualist seance, whatever she does on it, and suddenly this horrible change comes over her face, and she sees cities crashing and the archangel of the abyss, and then faints. And when she comes to, she's unable to recall anything of her vision, and seems quite shaken. And there's a very odd coincidence in that the newspaper account of Lutz's death mentions him saying something about an archangel.
She says she's never going to be involved in the occult again.
Yeah.
That's how bad this was. Wow.
Yeah, so that's the end of the spiritualist, really.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. But Vanneman believes that the two men, being Lutz and Blair, bought the two horses to sacrifice, much like one would to Poseidon. And again, it seems very strange that he would come upon this initially, though this confuses him as Poseidon isn't an archangel, which I have to admit is a rather odd sticking point for one. But
Yeah.
I guess,
It is a little strange.
Yeah. He tells Layla to leave and go somewhere else, that she might be in danger, but she refuses, and that night the storm rages again. Along with it come the strange hallucinations of horses, the sea, wailing, crashing, and all that. Vanneman wonders if his fate will be Lutz's and resolves to guard Layla. And one morning, as Robinson is leaving, he tells Vanneman that something wants his box. They're going out to sea to find this something, him, Layla, and the doctor, and Robinson already has a ship commissioned. Vanneman's quite apprehensive about this whole idea, and the captain that's been hired is dismayed that the boat has been turned into like this pleasure yacht and he's going to be carting around with some millionaire. But they do indeed load up the boat with luxuries, much to the captain's annoyance. And there's a thick fog on the water, and the doctor seems to be in this faint of drowsiness. The captain says the fog is no problem and they can sail right through it, and he uses the word sail out of familiarity, even though it's a steamship. And as they're pushing off with oars and not gasoline, the captain says there's too much weight on board, and he pushes Vanneman off. He's left on the platform screaming as the boat takes off, and someone tells him to shove off, and it's Blair. And Blair says that Robinson and Porter are due to show up soon and to take them off, and Vanneman says that they've been stolen off in another boat. And the real Captain Porter is quite angry and says that they can wire for the police and every ship down the river, as Porter got a good look of it coming in. He says it's primarily a sailing craft, though it must have some limited form of auxiliary power, as they get on board the real Nagaina, the name of the ship, in search of the vessel. Vanneman relates what he knows to them, and he omits some of the more fantastic details, and the doctor finds that after leaving the wharf, the drowsy stupor placed on him begins to clear. They receive word that the boat was sighted at Bombay Hook an hour prior, and the captain thinks this is impossible as it would have to be going way too fast for that kind of boat. Blair says that if they knew him, they'd know that nothing is impossible. And at this hint, Vanneman tells him to tell him what he knows. So Blair does and relates the adventure that we got in the prologue of the Portsmouth Belle. They were heading for British Guiana, where the ship encountered a calm, and they endured great waves and gales and is blown off course. And that's when they come up on these newly formed strange volcanic islands near the Azores. And Blair is one of the men who goes offshore with Captain Jessamy. And despite the great heat, he sees a strange green object in the lava, like a box almost, and figures that maybe he can hollow it out and sell it on shore for something. And the captain just laughs at him and says to go for it, and nobody's likely to claim this property. But back on board the Nagaima, they receive word that the stolen ship is even further away, and Blair goes back to his tale. Now, on board the Belle, he spent a great deal of time chiseling at the block, and under the outer crust, he finds the current box that they have. And he tells no one of this and says that the lava has crumbled to dust and throws the outer crust overboard. So everybody else on the ship will think that he left the island with nothing usable. But he's unable to open the box and makes several attempts to do so in secret, and Blair says that he is slow to wake up and notice what is rightfully missing from his possession. The Portsmouth Belle eventually runs into an oil tanker, and they're able to get the men off the ship, and they make port at Tremont. And they disembark, and Blair says that he's quite frightened by dreams of cities crashing down, white horses with their throats cut.
He woke him up.
Yeah. He says that he tracked down Robinson from Lutz, and as he goes to visit him, the dreams start to get more intense. And he tells Robinson that the box is ancient and horrible, and sees the tide start to rush in, and he jumps out the window to escape. He runs into Robinson in the street a few days later, and Robinson appears to be undergoing the same changes, And he's decided that he's going to keep the box, and this mysterious force is not going to take it from him. He's heard how Lutz killed himself instead of the horse, and thinks maybe the horse will satisfy Poseidon or whatever he is, as he knows exactly what the image is, but it didn't do any good. So he then encounters Robinson on the beach and sets up this voyage here, and that's how they come to be on the ship at present. And this mysterious force has a lot of names, and that's why Lutz called him an archangel, as it's something that is mentioned in the Old Testament, and that's something he would be familiar with and would have affected his view of the world and the presences in it. Vanneman believes the box to be some remnant of Atlantis, made by worshippers of Poseidon, and they receive word that the ship has now passed Cape May and is out to sea. Several hours later, the Nagaina reaches Cape May behind the Phantom vessel, and by this time, the Red Dolphin, the Phantom ship, sighted by many other ships, and from his pocket, Vanneman pulls out a letter from Professor Shellbach. There is a lot of linguistic analysis in it, particularly concerning the characters, which appear to be similar to ancient Phoenician, Semitic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs, and perhaps it's a common root language between the three. Shellbach wants more data, and in a postscript he contains what may be a translation of the inscription on the box: "To the great deep, to the abyss." They're now moving through dense fog, and eventually encounter the Red Dolphin, stationary, and they get their guns ready for boarding. They lose sight of the ship and circle around to try to find it, and they see a strange bubble of clear space through the fog, in which they see a huge shadow-like form. They eventually find the ship, and it appears to be black with rot and ancient age, and the ship appears to be strange and broken. And its auxiliary power is not steam, but rather strange oars, ceaselessly pushing the ship, which is an ancient trireme. Through the mist, they see some strange ships, horribly scary buildings instilling the fear in the crew. It appears to be an ancient city. And there is a huge statue of a white figure holding a trident and standing in a scarlet chariot being pulled by horses, and the statue almost seems to be in motion. Strange sounds start to be heard, sending tons of figures running, and out of the palace opens up a huge red metal door, and emerging from which is a man in robes bearing a green oblong block. He descends from the temple stairs and is followed by 6 men holding 6 stallions. The leader of this procession says some words, and the priest, if that's who they are, sacrifice the horses on the edge of the platform. 2 of the men are taken over the edge by their horse, and a black cloud spreads over the land, the mountain shooting fire. The leader of the procession screams and throws the box into the sea, and the Nagaima pulls into the bay. Vanneman is screaming to be put on the Red Dolphin. Robinson screams in the background, and the dead trireme seems to come to life, and Vanneman can make out the 2 figures on board. One looks like this priest, and the other is Leela. As he threw the box, he picks up Leela and throws her into the sea with superhuman strength, and Vanneman breaks free from Captain Porter's grasp and jumps into the water to try to save her. With much difficulty, he's able to get to Leela, and the Red Dolphin pushes away, and they're caught in really rough wake, and the seas from this supernatural weather are growing increasingly more violent, and Vanneman is struck on the head with something and falls unconscious. Porter has ordered a rescue, and his own men turn on him, but the crew is paralyzed by fear, by this whole climax of this green casket being thrown into the water by the priest of Poseidon. And Porter takes the controls and pushes towards them, and Blair, who is apparently more used to this sort of thing than the men are, is also unaffected by this scene, and he throws Vanneman and Leela a life preserver, which unfortunately hits Vanneman on the head.
Yeah.
But he moves in the right way where they can be pulled up and they're rescued.
I wondered if it would be heavy enough to knock him out, but I guess so.
Yeah, those things are pretty heavy, actually.
Yeah, it's heavy cork, it said.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. But Vanneman comes to a few days later, and he encounters Leela, and the 2 embrace, and she tells him that Uncle Jesse is still on the Red Dolphin, and that the pursuit is not ended, even though they barely escaped with their lives. On the Red Dolphin, Leela and Jesse were locked in this black hole, which was wet, spongy, and their captor says he comes from somewhere ancient, older than life, in a world of the Green Sea. He created a race of men, who then turned on him with the very knowledge he bestowed on them, and then rocks the earth in his anger, opening up a ground beneath the cities and bursting fire from the mountains. Their king, Azaius, offered atonement, worship, and sacrifice, but this wasn't enough, and finally he flings the gift of high secrets back into the ocean, which is the only thing that will mollify the god's anger. The voice tells Jesse, specifically the stronger souls around him acted as a shield, but no more, as he will face Robinson alone. The captain opens the door and looks like a dead man, and Leela goes on deck, and the ship is all slimy, rotting, and gross. The captain then picks her up and throws her overboard, and at this, Vataman goes to Porter to make the case for tracking down Jesse and the Red Dolphin again. At this, Porter throws something down on the table, and it's a piece of the Red Dolphin. It appears it's disintegrated into thousands of pieces as it moved away and is no more. With Jesse presumably dead, the ship gone, and the secrets of Atlantis underwater, it appears that Leela is now quite the rich inheritor of this vast fortune. And Vanaman repeats Robinson's motto of, "What I want,
I get. What I get, I keep."
Yeah.
And it's cool this time. It's great, in fact. It's romance.
Yeah, he says it's good advice in moderation, and with that, he goes out, presumably to sleep with Layla, and that's the happy end of this odd story.
Yes, under that one circumstance, it's all right. That motto's all right.
Yeah, it's so funny. The ending really made me laugh because it was so... I mean, we have no reason to think she isn't interested in him, I guess, but it's just it's like surprisingly one-sided. Like, there's not really any reason for it to be. Although...
Yeah. They are kind of flirting throughout the entirety of the novel, and that's one thing I didn't mention in the summary. I don't really call it sexual tension, but the banter between the back and forth of them, they're definitely, I think, interested in one another. The doctor immediately notices her beauty,
but she seems more passive than he is.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But I think there's something still in the back of her mind there.
Yeah, I just thought it was funny because we were like hating Jesse this whole time, what a horrible uncle he is, right? And he keeps repeating that annoying mantra of the ultra-capitalist bastard. Yeah. And then at the end, it's like, in the mouth of the doctor, all of a sudden, we're supposed to be like, yeah, man, go for it.
Yeah, and it's kind of really cold the way the doctor frames it, too, because, like, all right, this old man is dead and out of the way, and now I get his fortune. And his niece.
Yeah. She doesn't even really seem that... We don't really get to see much of it, but she doesn't really seem that bothered that her uncle's gone.
No, yeah. Along the lines of them flirting with each other for most of the novel, this is probably going to come up in some of the other stories tonight too, but these pulp magazines, I think, have introduced sex and scenes like that in a way that we really haven't seen too much in a lot of the 19th century stories, which in a way seem very sexless. Like in a lot of the Jules Verne and H.G. Wells stories, not only is there no tension like this between the male and female characters, a lot of times there just are no female characters whatsoever.
Yeah. The exception would be the Villiers, L'Île Adams, et Future, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's a different kind of thing going on there, but
it is,
otherwise...
That's kind of more like a obsession, I guess, whereas this feels more like, not necessarily lurid in ways that some of the other stories we'll be covering tonight and in the next couple episodes will be, but I guess more forward and more, not necessarily trashy, but lower brow, I guess, than maybe some of the other stuff.
She really does describe, especially Layla, as beauty, because mostly it's from Dr. Vanaman's perspective, but she also takes great delight in describing him and how handsome he is, right?
Yeah.
So they both get a lot of that kind of attention. Mm-hmm. And it does seem like, this is the era that just precedes the big explosion of films in the 1930s and stuff, and I don't know, I'm just wondering if kind of imagine some kind of 1920s film star or something like that playing that role. I just mean,
the pre-code era.
Yeah, some of those films are really interesting to watch. The Mae West stuff especially, even though they kind of passed a censorship screen before they got there, they're pretty forward in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect from films of that era. But I forget where I read this or saw this, but somebody online somewhere made the comment that a lot of genre writing and media is designed to appeal to a 14-year-old boy. And this story isn't necessarily as male gazy as some of the other stuff in the pulps are, but I think in the 1920s is where some of that stuff with the sex and the violence and some of the other stuff really kind of take hold as far
Yeah.
as maybe appealing to a less mature younger audience. That's not necessarily an insult in a way, because I think this novel is actually quite good. I really enjoyed reading this, but it's definitely present in a way that you wouldn't really find in a 19th century work.
Yeah, I think so. I do think that maybe in the non-English speaking world, you would have seen a little bit more of the sexual content, but in this particular way, it does seem an outgrowth of the pulps and the kind of I guess, way of perhaps objectifying people in a sense. Not necessarily always very harmfully or annoyingly, but I mean, it's a thing, right?
Yeah.
And, the human body became, I mean, we were talking about those Weird Tales covers earlier, right? And so these 1930s Weird Tales covers drawn by a woman of a very, very muscular male figure, usually coming to the rescue of females in bondage.
Yeah.
Somehow. Right.
And I think you see a lot of that element really present in the genre going forward. That's one of the things that really annoy me about a lot of Golden Age writers. Heinlein especially is one of the worst offenders of that.
But see, what's worse about guys like that is they consider themselves to be feminists.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what goes on in Heinlein's head, but...
So that's definitely an interesting aspect of this book. So what was the secret of Atlantis? It's something very specific. It's the same thing that Arthur Conan Doyle said they had in The American Deep, although it doesn't seem as significant there because it seems just like one of a million weird bits of knowledge they had.
Yeah.
But it is a device or a material or mineral with the ability to transmit thought waves in a way that can be pictorially or even tangibly represented.
Yeah, right.
So that's really cool. I like that. I don't know. I somehow, the two of them both, I guess I imagine, completely separately envisioned this notion. Conan Doyle uses it because the sailors on the ship that goes down to the depths of the ocean are actually displaying on a screen through the process of their mental processes to the denizens of Atlantis, the adventure they had, right? Mm-hmm. That was a really neat element of the American Deep that I appreciated. And then here it is. It's not really used. Well, I guess it is used because that box is what allows Poseidon to enter our world and bring the sea into this rich dude's house.
Yeah, and infiltrate the dreams of the characters with the horses and all the other stuff of the, I guess, flashbacks of presumably millennia prior.
Yeah. It does seem like this sort of lost race with their special knowledge, especially Atlantis. This was such a fascination of the 1920s and 30s. There's so many stories about lost Atlantis, right? Mm-hmm. And reading this, I kind of thought of the album cover of Manila Road's The Deluge.
Yeah.
It's Poseidon standing in the waves with his trident. And I don't know. It was very grandiose. I liked the climax of the book quite a bit.
Yeah, the climax was great. Really good at this haunting imagery. And she has a very good way of writing this kind of apocalyptic almost scene of the fire everywhere and black wood rotting from the age and all the other weird stuff going on.
The writing was a little... I think we both kind of covered this a little bit already, but the writing is a little funny at times. I don't know. I mean, it's just occasionally the way she phrases things and the fact that it's our second book with an exclamation mark in the title after right. The Mummy, Tale of the 22nd Century, right? And I don't know, just like funny little things that made me laugh. I kind of enjoyed them, but I'm not sure. I don't know if she really wanted them to be funny. Like, I had a good time with it, but sometimes I felt like maybe I was laughing at it a little bit, which I tend not to do. I mean, I'm not really a person who enjoys doing that most of the time, but I think it was just, there were good qualities about this that kind of offset that made me have a really good time reading it. And it's not a long novel, but it's also like a fast read. You know, it was fun. One of those things, the first things that I wrote down was when Vandermeer goes in to see, he checks out the room where Robinson's been attacked or something, and the window's been broken. The first thing he thinks is a bomb. Yeah. It just seems so random. Like, why would you think that?
Yeah, there are a lot of the random conclusions that characters make in this. Right. Like, you know, why would your mind go to that? But maybe it's the ancient telepathy and psychometry and all that affecting the characters that think in this strange way.
It's very enthusiastic, though. Like, the writing is very enthusiastic. I feel like, too, I don't know, I mean, an interesting thing about looking at these magazines, right, and I kind of alluded to this when we're talking about a lot of authors getting their start in weird tales, is that you see where a lot of these people got started. And while you can appreciate the stories for their own qualities, and while some authors maybe came out of the gate firing on all cylinders and all strong, a lot of the time, like, these are beginning stories among these people's writing careers. So in the cases of some of these authors, like Stevens, we don't know how much further she could have gone had she kept writing. I mean, literally, she was only writing extensively for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, about 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a shame, you know, like, I guess it just wasn't, it was like you were saying, it's a way to make money, and maybe not something that she was as passionate about in the end as other things. Who knows, right? We know so little about her.
Yeah, though in a sense, I think works by people like that are in a way refreshing to read. You know, while I did like Medusa and novels like that, sometimes people try maybe a little too much to be literary. And when you have somebody like this who just really isn't concerned about having deep thoughts or anything like that, and is just really writing an engaging story that's fun and she knows will sell to a magazine like a Muncie publication or I guess later Weird Tales, it's nice to read when they have a special talent, even if it's not a masterpiece or anything like that. It moves along quick and it's fun, and sometimes those can be just as enjoyable to read as something that shoots for something a little higher.
I agree. Yeah.
Like, it's a fun read. I did get through it much faster than Medusa, just because it's so quick and just very light. It's not heavy at all.
Yeah, we're not treated to any philosophical treatises on what Plato thought about Atlantis or any other ways she could have possibly taken it if she was so inclined.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the decadent Atlantis and the way they fell from grace it's not really the key point of the story, like the way it was with Medusa, to the point where everything else kind of gets overshadowed. We don't really understand the purpose of anything. Like, it's a fun story. It is a shame. I mean, I guess enjoying so many of these older writers, I do think about quite often, what would have happened if something had gone differently, right? And she'd carried on. I don't know. We've talked about doing one other book by her, The Heads of Cerberus, at some point later on in the podcast. That one looks like a more science fictional entry.
Yeah, that's what I understand from most of the people who I've seen write about her work. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed this, and I'm certainly interested in reading her other tales. She's credited as being one of the earlier authors as writing dark fantasy. I guess this would be a part of that claim, that is.
Yeah. I actually thought in a lot of ways the story did seem quite modern. Like, I mean, you know, we kind of make fun of the romance, and I still would, but like, when I used to work at the library, we got a lot of these, like, supernatural romance books.
Yeah.
And they're books about things like a fairy courting at a woman who works in an office or something, or like a werewolf dude and how his relationship starts with this woman and whatnot, and things like that are very common.
Yeah, especially after Twilight, that whole genre really exploded.
I guess so, yeah. I feel like it started before then, but I guess I'm not really enough of an expert to say, maybe that's probably really marked a takeoff in the paranormal romance, I think is the paranormal romance is what they call it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just, I mean, those two elements of the story were not really linked together. Like, it was just a paranormal story that happened to have a little bit of a romance to it.
Yeah.
And I would say the romance was definitely not emphasized as much as it would be in something from nowadays, I guess. even though it was there, and, there was a lot of the eye candy thing going on, right? But, I don't know. It felt modern. Like, in terms of everything we've done for the podcast so far, I would say that Claimed probably was close to feeling like the most modern mainstream fiction.
Yeah, certainly one of the more titles along those lines.
So, I don't know. If you're interested in where a lot of these tropes maybe kind of were floating around back in 1919, 1920, you could definitely do worse. This is a fun, quick read. I don't know. It touched a lot of buttons that definitely, like, have been grabbing me from a pretty early age. All that we talked about Lost Race fiction on the podcast before, and before I even knew what that was, reading Lovecraft and reading even some books by Abraham Merritt and stuff, where he really, really goes into that, like, almost the floweriest, most over-the-top, like, poetic in a way that some people might find overly flowery or something, a way of depicting that kind of thing. And it's also equally pulp, but in a kind of a different way. It's like he's kind of getting a little carried away with certain things and imagery and stuff, and it's purple, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like Merritt's writing style, and it's also a lot of fun. And he also talks a lot about, like, weird lost races in various parts of the world that have certain knowledge that people might find rather valuable if it was available to them today. So, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the story sort of suggested more that could have happened, more that could have gone on. Like, maybe the struggle between Jesse and Poseidon could have been more than it was. I don't know. But again, like, I don't know. In a way, the story feels very front-loaded. Like, it feels like there's a lot of build-up, and it's really awesome. And even though I really like the climax, it almost feels like she just had to end it because that was the last serial installment or something. And, like, it's like, okay, I'm going to end it with this big, cool climax. But I don't know, like, all these things that I started thinking about while reading it, she didn't really seem to want to go there. Like, there was the brief hint that there might be somebody helping them on their quest, like some kind of psychic investigator type person or something like that. And no, it just turned out to be his poor old aunt who's, like, got her brain frazzled by everything and then left. And then and then the whole, there's a lot of claiming going on. I mean, I think the book's title is certainly very appropriate, right?
Yeah.
Claimed. And there's a whole lot of claiming going on. And I would have liked to have seen certain aspects of that. I don't know, like certain aspect of the conflict maybe highlighted a little more. But I guess the story is what it is, and it's hard to know whether there was an earlier draft that was maybe not tight enough or something, and so this is what came out. I don't know. It felt to me like there could have been a little more to it, but I still really liked it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like even when you reach the end and it's revealed Jesse is still on the boat, and you think when you first are reading that he might still be on the boat and they're going to have like another expedition to go rescue him, it's like, oh, well, I only have like a couple pages left, and then it's finally resolved like, oh, he's probably dead. Yeah. He's probably disintegrated.
Shit, Jules Verne made a whole book out of it with Pym, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I guess one of us will have to write the sequel where it turns out Jesse's still alive and they have to go find him.
Yeah, transported back to ancient Atlantis or something like that.
Yeah, that is not what we got. And I thought she was kind of trying to make some kind of commentary about how wrong Jesse's avariciousness was, but that doesn't really... It doesn't really mean anything either, In the end, it's just more claiming. And,
maybe there's just good types of claiming and bad types. Yeah. Because even Porter, like, the reason they go on the quest is because he's like, well, Jesse is my charge. Like, he was supposed to be on my boat, so I guess we have to go rescue him.
Weird boat.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, a little funny thing I made in my notes, that the mate of Captain Porter's ship seems to he seems to take some delight in befuddling his captain, because we just see them, like, they're not really developed characters or anything, but whenever they appear, like, the mate's telling him something that's really impossible, and the captain's getting all flustered and going, "What? That's impossible!" It happened a few times, and it's kind of the only character beats those two halves, so it's just kind of interesting, because at least it was kind of funny, right? So, but I don't really have much to add about this. It's kind of it's a good lost race adventure with a bit of a sea voyage at the end and a chase, and it's a fun time.
Yeah, no, it's good, and I'm looking forward to reading the other novel for the podcast and some of the other stuff outside of it.
Heads of Cerberus.
Yeah.
It looks pretty wacky, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so with that, I think we're going to take a break, and we'll be back with some weird tales.
Nictzin Dyalhis has been covered before on the podcast, specifically his work When the Green Star Waned. If you have listened to that episode, you are probably aware of the scarce and contradictory information there is regarding him, which seems to be the case of quite a few authors from this time.
Yeah. We'll get to one next, actually.
Yes, but there's some misrepresentation going on sometimes with their lives. But When the Green Star Waned was in Weird Tales, but the story we're covering tonight is The Sea Witch, which comes specifically from the December 1937 issue, where it was the cover story. The Sea Witch starts with an older man named John Craig encountering a completely nude young woman washed up on the beach near his cottage during a storm. Despite the cold and harsh weather, the woman, Heldra Hellstrom, appears barely affected. She tells John of being aboard a sinking ship and jumping off of it, flinging herself on Rand's bosom, referring to the Norse sea god. John takes Heldra back to his cottage to provide her warmth and shelter. He offers her clothing to wear, which she refuses, instead choosing to put on a silk cloth that had covered John's table. She then tells John how she wants to look pleasing to him and claims her love for him. Loving him, she says, as Ragnar Waveflame loved Jarl Wolf Redbrand. She then calls him Jarl Wolf, claiming that he was him in a past life, but when John suggests she was Ragnar Waveflame, Heldra tells him Ragnar never died. After deciding to masquerade as John's niece, for he worries what will be said about him if people know he has taken a young woman into his home, he calls Ragnar her ancestress, and says she has visited her in her sea cave and learned the art of witchcraft from her. After this, she wishes not to tell any more about herself. Sometime later, after Heldra had been staying with John for a while, she asks John to take her sailing, which he agrees to. Heading out with only her silk robe despite the cold, she takes control of the ship, steering it near a reef and raging waves which miraculously part as she nears them. She then tells John to hold the boat at a specific spot before disrobing and diving into the water. After about an hour of waiting, Heldra emerges, hauling a chest up, which John helps her place in the boat. Once back at John's cottage, she heads into her bedroom with the chest, and then reveals herself costumed in fine jewelry, a gift from Ragnar. She then gives John a ring that once belonged to Jarl, a ring that has an incantation on it which Heldra implores him to learn, as it will shield him from any harm. As the cold weather abates and summer arrives, so too do people visiting the town John resides in. One man that comes to spend the summer is Michael Comnenus, described as suave, handsome, but quite arrogant. He eventually sees Heldra, they lock eyes, and he appears afraid of her, while she finds him equally distasteful. She asks John who he is, and when she hears his name, lets loose a furious speech in the Norse language. John, astonished, is then given an explanation. There was a Comnenus of the same name, a nephew of a Byzantine emperor, who performed an atrocious deed that left Norse people cursing the name, and Heldra believes this Comnenus is likely a reincarnation of that past one. Several days after this encounter, Heldra finds a fiddle John has stored away and asks him to play while she dances. Even though John admits to her that he can't play it, that he tried to learn it but doesn't have the talent for it, she prepares to hear him and dance to the music, taking out 4 lamps as well as a slab of stone, arranging it as though it were a mirror between them. It is, she says, a hell stone, which reflects and captures the images of whatever is before it. When John stubbornly drags his bow across the fiddle, he finds his motions are then taken control of, making him play the instrument expertly. As Heldra dances and her movements are captured by the stone, John realizes she is doing this as a larger plot against Michael. He is furious with her, and refuses to see her do anything against the man that might arouse suspicion towards them, and when he refuses to love her if she continues with her plan, she kisses him and says she knows he is lying, his words conflicting with his true feelings for her. She decides to leave town so no one will suspect her, and by extent John, of anything. After her departure, John is compelled by Heldra, as she appears to him as a shining double, to head to where Michael is staying while cloaked in invisibility granted by Heldra with the Hellstone, placing it under his doorstep. He runs into Michael several days later, who asks John when Heldra will be returning, as he has been dreaming of her, and, despite his initial dislike of her, has fallen in love with her. After this, at night, John calls to Heldra, summoning her and asking her to once again be cloaked from sight so he may retrieve the stone and prevent further harm to Michael. He tells her he will forgive everything else she has done if she grants him this one request, which she does, and tells him to afterwards come to a sea cave. John removes the stone and does as Heldra wishes. When he arrives at the cave, he finds Michael has come to, with a gun, as John was in fact seen removing the Hellstone. Heldra then arrives, grabbing the stone from John, and paralyzing Michael with her magic. When John tries to interfere and stop Heldra, she uses her power to force him back and against the wall of the cave. She reveals that she had wanted John to remove the stone and lead Michael into her trap. She then reveals what the latter man did in his past life, poisoning 3 brothers and their Viking crew so that he could steal their sister and keep her for himself. Once this is shown to Michael, he remembers his past actions, and the spirits of the Vikings he killed come to take his soul away. His soul is separated by Heldra from his body, and the connection between the two is severed, leaving the body alive but completely mindless, and the soul to be borne away with the Vikings. After this, John is released from his paralysis by Heldra, who explains that she was the sister that Comnenus had trapped, and that she had gone to Ragnar for help in seeking vengeance against him. She asks if John would take her if they were both young, which he affirms, so she kisses him and leaves with the ghost Vikings. John leaves the cave and then leaves town as he finds himself growing younger. The story ends mid-sentence, likely implying a return of Heldra. So I think that this story is probably the weakest of the ones that we've read, but I still enjoyed it.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
I think there's some good imagery and things to talk about with it.
I was telling Gretchen that I actually had to take a break halfway through this story, or maybe a little more than halfway through this story, and at that point I was kind of not liking it. And after I finished it, though, I realized that I did enjoy it. It caused me some pangs of, I don't know, I feel like Dyalhis knows this, and the protagonist knows this, and the sense of justice here is kind of not, it's a little bit skewed. I don't think that I'm really supposed to feel joyous about the death of this poor Michael Comnenus and his lost soul. I don't know. I mean, he seems to think that people hate him because he's a Don Juan, and it seems like the history of it is much worse than that, according to her and her remembrance of what happened in these past lives. And that whole reincarnation thing is not something that I personally subscribe to. So it just feels cruel and unfair.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it reminded me of the story, The Insanity of Jones, Study in Reincarnation by Algernon Blackwood. And Nate, I don't believe you've read this story,
No.
but Gretchen, I think you have?
Yes, I did a while back.
Yes, so this is a story about a man who works in an office in some crappy insurance company in like 1900s England. And this guy like sort of stands apart from everyone. He's very solitary. He's a loner. Nobody really likes him very much. And he feels like he has a glimpse into other worlds. And at some point through the story, he becomes convinced that this guy that he works for tortured him in a past life in the Spanish Inquisition. And he even has this spirit guide who's kind of like almost like the equivalent of Marley's ghost in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, who's like this old clerk that used to work at the company that died several years before, who like takes this Jones by the hand and shows him all the terrible things that were done to him during the Inquisition and tells him that he must either forgive or seek vengeance. And Mr. Jones chooses vengeance. So ultimately, it's a story of workplace violence. And because he essentially shoots his manager and then tries to kill himself. And that's pretty much how the story ends, because he can't kill himself. The gun wouldn't fire or something like that. And it just ends like that, with him screaming that he's ready to face the consequences of his act because now justice has truly been done. And I don't know, like, it's kind of significant that, like, the subtitle of the story is A Study in Reincarnation, but the real title is The Insanity of Jones, despite the fact that Algernon Blackwood is really into reincarnation and writes about it a lot in his stories. There's no doubt that we are meant to think that the actions of the protagonist of the story are pretty fucking nuts.
Yeah.
And he writes it in a really cool, subtle way where it's like, he shows us that. He doesn't just tell us that the dude's crazy, you know?
Yeah. I mean, this is pretty much the opposite of
Yeah.
And, I was talking about how the flirting and the sex is a little more forward and claim than a lot of the stories previously. This is, like, really cranking it up with the male gaziness, sex stuff. I mean, Heldra's just, like, naked the entire time, lounging around, and she's saying, like, really inappropriate things to Craig, even in the context of, like, her being a seducing witch. Some of the lines, I was just like, wait a minute, really? But I don't know. Some of the imagery was okay, I guess. I mean, I didn't dislike this one, but I wouldn't really necessarily recommend it either. I thought the Green Star was a lot more interesting than this one.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not bad, but
I kind of like that it made me think about some of these things, though. Like, she makes him do a lot of stuff against his will.
Yeah, right.
Through this story. And he kind of shrugs it off at the end because she repays him by making him younger again. And she's really hot. And, you know, but, like, she's very determined to do this thing. And his wishes and considerations don't really seem to come into it.
And even his restoration of youth almost seems like a curse because he feels forced to leave his village or this shore town or wherever they are. I don't know if they specify.
I think they sort of did. I can't remember, though. I'm not sure. Somewhere in the United States.
Yeah, I was picturing like on the Great Lakes somewhere, but maybe that's off. But
I'm guessing it was like the Northeast.
Yeah, but he's forced to leave this village because like he's worried about what the people are going to think about him suddenly looking younger, and suddenly this Michael Comendus playboy is missing, and what's the deal with that? And he's worried that people might connect the two events, so he just like packs all his stuff up and leaves. But he has this uncontrollable yearning to return to Heldra.
Right. And, you know, he's obviously drawn to her, but he says right in the beginning she's damnable. Like, you know, there's just, she's done terrible things. Like, and he knows this. I mean, there's a certain amount of, like, lecherousness, you know, and, like, how we're supposed to regard her beautiful, statuesque nude form, I guess. But, I mean, it did get me thinking about some of these things. And I do have to bring up, Nate, that bizarre piece of Sea Witch, not quite fan fiction that you found. So this is something on, what was it, this Fanfiction Network?
Yeah, I guess there's also a self-published version of it somewhere in book form, but somebody somewhere used a gender-swapped name of Dyalhis' name, so I think it was like Nikita Dyalhis, and they just went through this story and changed the two genders of the character. All the other words are word for word, just Craig is now a woman and Heldra is now a man. And it's just very strange. Like, why?
So, at first, so here's the thing. At first I thought, oh, like, it's just somebody who wants to experience the other side of the sexual, like, aspect of the story, right? And be titillated, right?
Right.
And I thought, okay, this is kind of dumb. Like, it's just very basic. Like, that you could have done a little more with it than that. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if they actually did this as a kind of a thought experiment, knowing the involuntary aspects of certain things about implications of the story. Just kind of thinking, well, what would it be like if a woman was forced to do the things that he was forced to do in the story? I don't know. It's just a thought that I had. Like, I don't really see any other point to it.
The gender swap version, in a way, does feel more in line with, like, the modern paranormal romance thing. And from what I can tell, it is kind of recent, like within the last 10 years or so. So I don't know if this person was going for that or had that in mind.
I don't know. I almost feel like it was more an experiment to see whether an audience would be discomfited by that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't know. Do you see what I'm getting at, or am I just sort of...
No, I do.
Nowhere.
Yeah.
But it's just really hard to say because literally that's the only thing changed with the text. Like, it's not
I know.
like the narrative changes or anything like that. It's not like inspired by the Sea Witch.
Yeah, they didn't actually put any real work into it or anything. But I kind of started to think like that, though. At first, my initial thought was, oh, like they wanted to just do that for their own amusement, to play up the sex angle and have the sexy Norse Viking be a sexy man rather than the sexy woman. But now I'm kind of thinking they actually wanted you to, or maybe they didn't think they would have an audience, but they just wanted to present the idea of, well, what would if the sexes were reversed, how uncomfortable would you feel with the way this story planned out?
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. The fan fiction author seems just as mysterious as the original one, so maybe we'll never know.
Yeah. So this was definitely a lot less sci-fi than When the Green Star Waned.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is probably the least science fiction thing we read for this episode, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
It does fit with the general theme, I think, especially of the last two stories we read of the ancient gods somehow returning to meddle with modern affairs.
And she does have a couple of neat tech gadgets, like a weird stone that records images.
Yeah, right.
A mirror that shows the true aspects of things, I guess. Right? I don't know. I mean, Dyalhis doesn't really go too much into the science aspect, but he does talk a little bit about it in terms of the Hellstone and how it might work. Pretty vaguely, though. It's obviously not something that he's primarily interested in. He'd probably be one of those Weird Tales authors who, at least in public, spurn science fiction a little bit, even though definitely When the Green Star Waned had a lot of the brand new, I guess, space opera kind of trope things happening in it.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is about 10 years later than that, I think.
Yeah.
This is late 30s and that was late 20s.
Yeah. This was from 37.
Yeah. Yeah, so a bit later. I mean, it just feels like he got like less mature as he went on, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I think that this kind of thing was... I mean, I'm a really big fan of the Conan stories. I love them unreservedly, but they are certainly appealing to some of the baser aspects of the reading audience sometimes, you know,
right.
With sex and violence galore, right? Mm-hmm. And those stories were really popular, like immensely popular. Most of them got to be cover stories in Weird Tales. According to Mike Ashley, and also the person that did the little bio piece at the beginning of the Dyalhis megapack from Wildside Press, the Dyalhis stories were very popular in their time.
Yeah, I mean, well, this one made the cover.
Right, and people seemed to like them. Ashley didn't necessarily think this was deserved, but he still leaves a little space for him in his very, very comprehensive history of the pulp science fiction magazines. So, yeah, it's just interesting. I mean, he probably thought, oh, the sword and sorcery stuff is really selling. Robert E. Howard's doing really well with his, like, barbarian fantasies and stuff. Howard was dead by then, of course, 1937. But I imagine people thought a lot about those stories still, and there were reprints, and he probably just thought, not to say that this story is like Robert E. Howard, because it's not exactly, but I can see the same kind of cover kind of coming up for it. I don't know. You said it was the cover story, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So what did you all think of the cover?
It's much like the story.
Yes, it is. I was about to say it. It has a grasp on the sex angle.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that isn't surprising, and it's definitely also, I mean, one of the things that sold the magazine, for sure. So, there was definitely, like, more, I guess, overt eroticism in something like Weird Tales than there would have been in, like, Amazing Stories or something like that.
Yeah, definitely on the covers, though I've seen some Amazing Stories covers which do have nudity and things like that on it, though. They don't really put it forward on, like, literally every issue that Weird Tales does.
Yeah. I think there were a lot of maidens getting rescued from clutches of weird alien kind of stories there, too.
Yeah, right.
Which is kind of what makes Clara Winger Harris's Fate of the Posidonia interesting, but we might be coming to that at a later time. We have one of our other stories coming up soon, too.
Yeah.
But, I don't know, I mean, I would have been really into this story, The Sea Witch, maybe a little more when I was younger, too, because I was really interested in the Norse stuff and Vikings and all that. I feel like even though this doesn't overtly mention a lot of the basic mythology, I feel like Dyalhis maybe would have gotten the little things that Gertrude Stevens didn't quite get about the whole Norse thing. You know, he probably would have nailed all that. So I would have liked this story a lot at that time. And now, just kind of like, yeah, I just kind of think of Blackwood. I think of like, well, that doesn't seem sane to me, you know, like, especially as she even says at one point, you were modern and you wouldn't understand. And that's why we're going to cut your soul from your body and your idiot body can just wander home or something.
Yeah.
Right? Just like, yeah, if you're a modern and you don't understand, doesn't that negate your guilt? I don't know. I would think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that we're not just shaped by our experiences, but that's a very big part of who we are, you know? So if that person, Michael Comines, never experienced the experiences of the Byzantium Comines, then he shouldn't be held accountable for actions of that person. But, I mean, I get it. It's kind of this whole, the soul becomes transubstantiated into new forms over time, right? And it's just something that a lot of people believed and probably still believe.
You still see that kind of idea of, like, eternal life and souls passing from one body to the next in genre media today.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I'm trying to think of examples from nowadays, but I know they exist.
Yeah, I mean, the show What We Do in the Shadows has some examples of that. It's one that I've watched kind of recently.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I want to check that out, actually. You got things like The Highlander, right? Although he's supposed to be an immortal, I think. So, interesting tale. Very tangential. Like, we didn't really, you know, sometimes, infrequently, I guess we have a little familiarity with the stories before reading them. I don't know if necessarily I would have chosen this story to read knowing what it was beforehand, but I'm not unhappy to have read it. Definitely, I think that science fiction fans will perhaps only find this of marginal interest, but if you're into that kind of epic grandeur of the whole, like, beings from across time, you may really like this.
Yeah.
I don't think it was badly written, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I may not have gone out of my way to read this before, but I don't regret reading it. I still think there's some enjoyment in it.
Yeah, there's better, there's worse. You know, it's kind of middle of the road, but I think enjoyable, especially if you're a fan of the pulpy Weird Tales stuff.
Yeah. And if you want to read an early example of space opera stuff, then you could definitely check out When the Green Star Waned as well.